I mean, how do you expect China to take that sort of criticism seriously when what we're told is the chief defender of the international rules-based order hasn't even signed up for it?
Boys and girls, welcome back to the Carnage House. We've got a big interview today with the director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at UTS and economist and academic by trade, Professor James Laurenceson. How are you?
Good, thanks, Dougal. Good to be with you.
Well, thanks for coming on. We're going to focus on China today and the Australia-China relationship and talk about a few different things. But I think the most pressing issue on people's minds as of today is the coronavirus.
Right.
And I checked this morning the stats. There's about just under 25,000 cases worldwide, just under 500 deaths and 14 active cases in Australia. Some of them might have recovered, I don't know.
3, as I understand it, are already out of hospital, yes.
Okay, beautiful. And Scott Morrison has decided that all flights coming back from mainland China to Australia, all the passengers must first go to Christmas Island to get quarantined for 2 weeks, right? So the first question I want to ask you is, how do you think Scott Morrison's response is, and what should Australia do about it?
Yeah, so he's been pretty much on the front foot, hasn't he? I mean, the US sort of took that strong action, and very soon afterwards, Scott Morrison followed suit. And I've been very clear to say that, it's important that we have strong public health responses. I think there's legitimate questions being asked in terms of those Australians being quarantined on Christmas Island. We know other countries haven't done that. So, for example, the Americans, they've taken some similar measures, but they flew people from Wuhan, the epicenter of the viral outbreak in China, to California. The Japanese flew them to Tokyo, and we flew ours to Christmas Island. So, I think there's some fair questions to be asked about whether that's the appropriate response. And I think it'd be in Scott Morrison's own interest to get on the front foot and explain that as well. Why is it that Australia has taken that approach? There may be some sensible reasons for it, but I don't think we've had that articulated as clearly as it could have been.
And how serious do you see the virus as being? Because there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of hype about it, but it also seems, I think there's a 2% fatality rate around about. Should we be worried about the virus?
Yeah, Dougal, I'm happy to listen to the medical experts, right? Yeah. So I don't think you want to be listening to me or anyone else, frankly. So if Australia's medical authorities are saying, look, stopping these flights is a good idea, or preventing Chinese tourists and students to come, well, that's fine. I mean, they're the ones with the expertise. Again, I think it's important that the reasons are explained, because we know other countries aren't doing that. So I think of the UK, for example, that's a country Australia would usually regard as pretty like-minded to us. They're letting Chinese tourists and students. Canada, another one, liberal democracy, OECD country, they're not doing that. So again, there could be some reasons why Australia is taking a different approach, but I think it'd be helpful if that's articulated. Otherwise, what happens is people just start asking questions, right? And rumours spread, and then it becomes a bit of a mess.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I read an article, this is just me spitballing here. I think I saw an article that said the coronavirus, as people aren't working, they're not really going outside, is costing the Chinese economy like 200 or 300 billion. I think it might have been from your Twitter feed, actually.
Right, okay.
What's the effect going to be on China? Can China recover? Well, what's kind of the outlook, do you think, for China over the next few months?
Next few months, pretty nasty. And I think the big thing to remember there is that the Chinese economy now is not driven by exporting manufactured goods as it was 10 years ago. Domestic consumption is the big driver, the services economy in China. So not manufacturing, not primary industries, it's restaurants, tourism, that sort of thing. That's the big driver. Last year, about 2/3 of China's overall growth came from domestic consumption. Now that is taking a massive hit at the moment. Chinese people just aren't going out of their apartments. Yeah. So in other words, they're not participating in the services economy. I guess there's an online services economy, but there's no doubt that is a key part of the economy now. And China's economy, I'm still pretty positive overall, but it has become a bit of a single-engine aircraft in that 10 years ago, manufacturing was going great guns, services was going great guns. Now manufacturing's leveled off, so it really has been services that has been driving things, and now that's taking a hit. So yeah, it's not pretty for China.
I mean, some of my friends just can't go outside of their house, their dormitories. One of my Chinese friends did like a series of Instagram stories about kind of what people are doing inside their own house to keep them occupied, because they can't leave their own house for like 3 weeks. And there was a good one of like a Chinese guy fishing in his fish bowl,
right?
Just trying to catch his own fish. So
Guaranteed
to little bowl.
Get a catch, I imagine.
Or people making like 10-pin bowling alleys with like bottles and things like that. I mean, it seems like if people actually aren't going outside, I mean, it's going to be really hard for a lot of the Chinese people, right? Like shop owners,
Absolutely.
Everybody.
Absolutely, yeah. And look, that has knock-on effects for Australia. I'm sure we'll probably get onto that. But a lot of Australian, premium food and beverages that are consumed at restaurants and hotels, well, people aren't going anymore. So, there will be an impact on beef, wine, those sorts of things that we've actually done really well at selling to China, particularly in recent years.
Okay, for sure. We've only got you for about half an hour, so I'm going to quickly move on to the next one, which is Chinese influence in Australia. And you'll see a headline often with Chinese influence or tags Chinese influence. But I want to kind of see what you think about the nuts and bolts of it in terms of Chinese political influence in Australia and Chinese economic influence, let's say control over Australian assets.
Yeah.
So in the first one, political influence, we saw that big China spy story a few months ago, big 60 Minutes piece on it, which even had politicians like Andrew Hastie, and I think James Patterson was on there.
Right.
It was run by kind of every major news publication, and then it came out a few months later that he was not a big enough spy for Australia to even worry about, according to Australia's intelligence services. We also have questions about like Gladys Liu. We have questions about we had the Sam Dastyari saga.
Yeah.
Political donation seems to be a theme throughout. Should Australia be concerned about China trying to exert influence?
Yeah, so massive question, Dougal, and you've just highlighted why it is a big question because it cuts across so many different areas. Should we be concerned? Of course we should. We've got the former ASIO head, Duncan Lewis, saying the level of foreign interference is unprecedented. Well, okay, right? It's unprecedented. Right. So we should absolutely take it seriously. I guess there's a couple things that I do respond to that with, though. And one is China. There could be attempts at influence, and let's take our security agencies at their word for that. That's fine. But attempts at influence don't necessarily translate to success. So I'm not even attempts should be taken seriously. But what we'd really worry about is if political decisions are being changed in response to those Chinese influence attempts, right? I mean, that's when our democracy really takes a hit. And on that point, I think the evidence is pretty clear that any political influence China has tried to exert, frankly, they've failed miserably. Let's have some confidence in our institutions for a start. You mentioned media coverage. Well, has there been a week in Australia over the last 2 years where there hasn't been a China influence story? So, our free and independent media, which is, welcomed and everyone likes it, I think it's doing a good job, to the point where you do actually get stories like this Wang Liqiang spy story, whereas a big splash in the media at the start, and then shortly afterwards, people start...
probably like a page 12 retraction or something.
That's right. And so... Yeah, just on the Wang Liqiang, I actually worry that can be damaging. I'm not really worried about Chinese influence. What I'm worried about is media credibility, right? So if we see a number of those stories where big headlines get splashed with huge claims, I mean, the story was that he was a Chinese spy.
Yeah, I mean, the ABC ran a headline that this was the, I think, biggest espionage scandal or something since the Petrov affair in the Petrov thing in 1994.
Correct. Right. So that's the headline, Dougal. And then a couple of weeks later, not quite, the evidence isn't backing that up. So what does the average person on the street think? Australian media can't really trust them anymore. And I think that's a tragedy because ASIO said that Chinese interference is a real concern. Media is one of our best sources of protection, but if their legitimacy is eroded through seeking headlines, no one wins out of that. And aside from that, probably the other thing I'd note is think about Australia's political decisions and strategic alignments over the last 2 years. Have we become closer to China? Not really. I mean, we were critical of their decisions in the South China Sea, as we should be. We've been very critical of their handling of human rights issues, such as what's happening in Xinjiang at the moment. We've got an Australian detained in China at the moment without access to a lawyer or his family. The Foreign Minister's been very outspoken, annoyed the Chinese embassy in Australia in a big way. And the Australian government, at least, in its strategic settings and its security relationship, is moving closer towards the United States, which is exactly the opposite of what China would hope for. So again, let's take the influence seriously, but keep some, let's keep the discussion grounded.
Yeah, well, I've seen some of your analysis, and people often get put into the camps of the hawks or the doves, pro-China, anti-China. Yeah. It seems like the intelligence community in Australia, and probably in America as well, has a lot of what would be like hawkish sentiments, or saying we should be careful about China seeking to exert influence in the region. And then the doves would be maybe someone like Keating, who comes out and is really pro-China as it goes. How do you see that debate in Australia, and where should Australia be? Because there's obviously an economic incentive to be closely tied to China and keep China happy. But it seems that there's also, like, do we have to be, like, how cautious should we be about our relationship with China?
We should be cautious. We should be cautious, absolutely. China involves challenges and opportunities. For example, I think some Chinese actions do threaten Australia's interests, right? An example of that would be in the South China Sea, right? Ignoring an arbitral decision, an arbitration panel assembled under the United Nations Law of the Sea. We say, and I think rightly, that we take international law and multilateral forums seriously, because we're only a relatively small player. So might is right is never going to work for Australia. So when China does things like that, I think we should be...
Can I ask you one question?
Sure.
There? I think everyone likes the idea of international law and following things. But at the same time, China can... I'm open to China's argument in the South China Sea, just because my understanding is China says, well, if this is our one access to, like, the sea, and we have like 1 billion people dependent on food, we can't have other countries, like, having control over that seaway. And at the same time, if China says, well, you talk so much about international law, why is there so many troops in the Middle East? Yeah. I think it's a pretty hard line to be so critical of China in that sense if we don't necessarily follow it ourselves.
It's a hard argument to disagree with, Dougal. And so I'm kind of in a similar boat. I mean, I like the idea of international law. I understand why the Australian government emphasises it. But, well, let me give you another specific example from the South China Sea. The US has criticised China for not following the United Nations Law of the Sea. Well, it hasn't even ratified the United Nations Law of the Sea. So how does that work? I mean, how do you expect China to take that sort of criticism seriously when what we're told is the chief defender of the international rules-based order hasn't even signed up for it? And as you said, let's not fall into logic fails as well. So what the US also says is that they're worried that China could close down freedom of navigation, close down access to the South China Sea. Well, can we just say that's ridiculous? I mean, that is just silly. Why? Because the overwhelming majority of trade that goes through the South China Sea is with China. So why would they stop their own trade? Are they going to stop their own exports going outside? Are they going to stop their much-needed oil and iron ore and food supplies? I mean, that is just ridiculous. So I think you're right to be a bit sceptical. And frankly, I think when these sorts of issues get raised, people like you, maybe people like me, need to be a bit more on the front foot and point out that there's some pretty ridiculous things that are being said.
Okay. To get to the second part of the original point, of Chinese control over Australian economic assets. Yeah. You wrote a couple of articles about kind of failed Chinese bids for, one was the Kidman Cattle Station, one was Ausgrid, the New South Wales electricity distribution company, I think. When Scott Morrison was the treasurer, he denied those bids, right? You did a good analysis of it. You can explain it, but they justified it on national security grounds, I believe. Is there national security grounds for stopping Chinese ownership of things like Ausgrid, big cattle stations, or things like that?
Yeah, so this is you're right. They were both rejected, as being contrary to the national interest, because that's the criteria that Australia uses. It's deliberately vague so that it gives the Australian government flexibility. On Ausgrid, you can imagine. No, it's not too difficult to imagine that there could have been national security issues there. You're talking about an electricity grid, critical infrastructure. Well, I think we can get that. Not just mine, many people criticised that particular one, not so much for the decision, but the process, right? You literally had the New South Wales government doing investment roadshows up in China, touting these assets, inviting bids. Well, they got a few bids. The New South Wales government said, there's no problem, it's all fine. We've talked to the Australian government, and literally at 1 minute to midnight, the federal government said you can't. So, I mean, that's a debacle of a process. But the national security concerns, well, I'm open to that being a legitimate concern. But let's get it right, how we put these sales in the market next time. Now, the Kidman deal is a very different scenario. So there you can certainly imagine things like community concerns, right? The fact, I think it was about 2% of Australia's agricultural land, if I remember rightly. I was back in 2016. I could be a bit fuzzy. But saying it's a national security issue, that's a bit of a stretch. I mean, a lot of Kidman's properties are close to desert. They're very pretty rough ground. It's not a critical infrastructure asset. So, when we make these decisions, we're entitled to reject foreign investment, okay? And it's not just China that's been rejected. We've rejected investments from the US before as well. But let's make the process a robust one, and the decision, let's clearly communicate why we made particular decisions.
Let's talk about the Belton Road. So the Belton Road is a pretty huge project, which, from what I understand, kind of is aimed at recreating the Silk Road of the big trade route from hundreds of years ago. You'd know a lot more about that than me. There's a lot of talk about whether Australia should participate in it or not. For those people who don't know, which is including me, how would you describe the One Belt, One Road? And should Australia seek to play a part with China in that?
Yeah, that's a killer question, Dougal. And here's why. Because the Belton Road is everything and it's absolutely nothing at the same time. So what China describes it as is a connectivity issue, right? So infrastructure, for example, is what the newspapers in Australia will talk a lot about: building roads, railways, ports, that type of trade connectivity. Actually, China talks more broadly than that. So it talks about 5 pillars of connectivity. It talks about financial flows, policy coordination, people-to-people flows. So it's a much broader discussion. And look, I think we should welcome closer connectivity. One of the reasons why Australia doesn't sell more of its goods internationally is because of logistical issues, right? It costs too much, or it takes too long to ship goods from Australia up into the markets, particularly in North Asia. So improving connectivity, that's good for Australia. Should we be part of it? The argument that we shouldn't be is because some people say it has a strategic bent, so it's designed to tie countries closer to China. And we're a security ally of the US, so they say, well, that wouldn't be in our interest to be tied closer to China. I guess I'm a bit sceptical of that view, because we don't get to control the decisions of other countries, right? So if it's in other countries' interest to be closer to China, they're going to get engaged. They're not going to not be engaged in the Belton Road because Australia says they shouldn't be. China's economic rise is a reality, and that's the fundamental driver. I mean, even if there was no such thing as a Belton Road initiative, the truth is, the Lowy Institute did some good research on this, and the number of countries that count China as their major trading partner now far exceeds the number that have the US as their major trading partner. So that shift in economic power is happening with or without the Belton Road. So that's another reason. I don't think we can get too hung up on these things because it's happening anyway. So I think that's probably and also the final point would be, you can stay on the sidelines, but then you're guaranteed to have no impact. Now, some people may say, well, if you get involved, you're not going to have much impact anyway. Well, okay, but I promise you, if we don't get involved, we're going to have zero impact. And there have been examples before, like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, for example, which was another Chinese development initiative that Australia got involved in. We chose to sign up to it under Prime Minister Abbott. And we're actually really happy with the outcomes. That is, Australian input really did help to shape that institution.
What would Australian participation in the One Belt, One Road look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we tend to discuss it in terms of infrastructure, right? And this is one of the reasons why it doesn't get a lot of traction in Australia, because we say, well, Australian companies probably aren't going to be contributing to building a railway in Kazakhstan. Or then that's right. I would argue that's failing to understand the possibilities of the Belton Road. As I said before, from China's perspective, it's about connectivity more generally. So I think there would be no problem using the Belton Road, frankly, as an excuse to discuss with China, which we have these huge economic complementarities with, to build new types of trade connectivity. Make it easier, for example, for Australian beef to get into China. And if they want to put that discussion under the Belton Road, well, who cares, right? Because we just want better access to the booming Chinese market. I'm not so sure, standing on the sidelines and being worried about its strategic ends, which are happening anyway, really serve our interests.
Well, what do you say about the concerns about quote-unquote debt trap diplomacy? I think often the example of, railroads between Kenya and maybe Ethiopia get brought up, where it's the idea that if China gives a big loan to a country to build a piece of key infrastructure, and then the company can't pay the loan back, then China takes control of that key infrastructure. What do you say to that argument?
Bollocks.
Yeah.
That's what I say to that argument. And this is one, I've got some strong views on this, as you've probably gathered. So the Chinese government has propaganda talking points. They're not the only ones. And if the American government has one talking point that keeps coming up, it's this argument that China is engaged in debt trap diplomacy, right? It just rolls off the tongue. It really is a US government talking point. Academic studies have been done by people completely independent. They've looked at all these countries, and this argument that it's like a drug, right? We're pushing this debt on you, and then you become addicted to it, and then you're in our power. There's very little evidence that actually backs up that argument. You think about it, Dougal. If I'm the lender, you're your own country. I give you a lot of money. We build a port in your country. Well, who's at risk? My capital is in your country. You've got entirely jurisdiction. If you want to nationalise that asset, gosh, I am in a hugely vulnerable situation. What am I going to do? Send in the army if you choose to do that? So actually, the people who have the power in that situation is in fact the host country. It's not like a drug that they become addicted to it. And in any case, economists have looked at the numbers involved in terms of the share of debt that a country owes to China. And Chinese debt is not the chief is not the driver of debt in many of these vulnerable countries.
Well, I have heard from different people, just in conversations, that the US has previously done debt trap diplomacy in South America. You're going to have to fact check me on that and leave it in the comments. But finally, the final thing I want to talk about is the Xinjiang camps.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of noise about the Xinjiang camps, and it's hard to find truth with the Chinese government, which is not that transparent. I mean, I was in Shanghai a few months ago and talked to the AFR correspondent Mike Smith,
right,
who participated in a media tour, which went to one of the camps facilitated by the Chinese government, and it looked apparently a lot like a kind of set up, a fake camp. They got to talk to a couple of the people who were there, who looked like they were just reading off lines and pretending to be happy, stuff like that. So for people who don't know, it's like Xinjiang is basically the Muslim, it's a majority Muslim province in China, and China talks about these vocational or re-education camps as de-radicalization of the population. Started a few years ago, estimates are about 1 million people are there, but then other people say it's more like a prison, and they're not there of their own free will. And that the one last piece of context is last year there was a dump of what's called the Xinjiang Papers,
right,
which detail, which apparently are official government documents. The Chinese ambassador to the UK denies them, I think, quote unquote, called them fake news.
Heard that before. Who else says that line? Yeah.
Well, it's one of our friends of the channel, Donald Trump. But what do you think about the Xinjiang camp? Because if the rumours are true, and it would be very concerning.
Oh, absolutely. And I guess my take on this, I'm an economist, so I don't claim to specialise in China's minority groups, but you do get to a point, I think, where the weight of evidence becomes so overwhelming that everyone should be listening to it. And on this particular issue, actually in Australia, we're really lucky. We've got more than one academic who specialise particularly in Xinjiang and the issues around there.
Maybe we'll talk to him.
I would encourage you to. They'd give you a better comment than I would on this. And the thing I note about those academics is actually on China generally, they actually have a spectrum of views. You've kind of got people who are more hawkish on China and you've got people who are more dovish on China. But on Xinjiang, they are all absolutely in alignment that this is a human rights tragedy on a pretty darn large scale. This is extrajudicial detention. So, the Chinese government says it's to de-radicalise, all right, but extrajudicial detention of hundreds of thousands at a minimum, that's pretty confronting for a country like Australia that's a liberal democracy. And even if the Chinese government says, well, it's our internal affairs, butt out, that doesn't really wash either, because we've got Australian residents and citizens, not a lot, but a few of them who are actually in these camps. So the Australian government, it's not something the Australian government can just, sit on the sidelines over. I mean, they've been pretty outspoken, and I think that's justified, frankly.
Is there any, I don't know, could Australia do anything conceivably?
Not a lot. I think the best, and so that's an argument to do nothing. Some people say, well, if you can't do anything, what's the point? Why make a big song and dance of it and perhaps put, economic links if we can't actually have much of an impact? I get the argument, but it's pretty extreme, and I think it's justifiable for the Australian government to do something, particularly when as I said before, we've got direct interests there in terms of our citizens and residents being tied up in them. Okay,
fantastic. Well, thank you for talking to us. I appreciated it. Where can people find you?
Well, I'm on Twitter. I'm sure I'm not as popular as you, Dougal, but J_Laurenceson. That's my Twitter handle.
And we'll put it in the description.
Get on there and I tweet out a bit. Do my best.
We'll put a link to the Australia-China Relations Institute as well. Of course, you can support Carnage House, like on Facebook, follow Instagram, subscribe YouTube. If you really darn like us, you can support us on Patreon. I think that's all for today. Let us know what you thought in the comments, and hopefully we can be with you again soon.